Hi there! March has come to an end and somehow we find ourselves in April. For me that means the semester is starting again, which means my reading will probably take a hit. But I read quite a lot in March, so I'm looking forward to sharing those books with you today. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host Jules, and like I said, March was a pretty good reading month, in part because we had quite a lot of days off for Easter. I'm always surprised by how long Easter feels, and this time of course it came extra early, and I took advantage of those days. I've got some romances lined up for you. I dove into a new genre, and some fantasy, and even some nonfiction as well. So, without further ado, let's dive in. The first book I read in March is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden, which is the first book of the Winter Night trilogy. And this was actually a reread for me. I read this trilogy back when it first came out, which in the case of The Bear and Nightingale was back in 2017. And I fell in love with the world that Katherine Arden created. The Bear and the Nightingale is set in kind of this medieval Russia, and it focuses on a young girl called Vasilisa, also known as Vasya, to her siblings. And she and her family kind of live in a farmstead, kind of in the Russian wilderness, far away from the capital. Vasya's mother died when she was born, but Vasya has inherited her ability to connect to the more mythological and folklorish side of her society, so she can communicate with the household spirits and with the nature spirits as well. And these are the elements that Katherine Arden has drawn from Russian folklore and mythology. But Vasya also lives at a time where these kind of folk beliefs are shifting into a more settled Christianity. So there's something of a religious conflict kind of going on. And there's also the issue of her being a bit of a wild child, which doesn't really fit into the gender expectations of her society. So Vasya finds herself in the middle of all these different conflicts, but she has a strange ally, which is a blue-eyed winter demon. And she's special to him, although she doesn't quite know how or why he has such an interest in her. And that's all I'm going to tell you about the plot, really. I love these books. They have a very strong fairy tale vibe. So for those who are looking for a more straightforward kind of fantasy, this might feel a little too fairy tale-like. But it's that aspect that I specifically love. I love that Katherine Arden takes her time to really build up Vasya as her main character, to introduce us to this kind of mythology step by step. I like the way magic sort of plays a role. Yeah, it's a really nice trilogy, and The Bear and the Nightingale is a really good first book of this trilogy, which really gives you a sense of Russia as its setting, of its history, and I think it's just a really good story. So that doesn't tell you a whole lot, but all I can say is that I picked up The Bear and the Nightingale again because I wanted to lend it to a friend, and I thought, well, before I recommend it to her, let me give it another read through to see if I love it as much as I did when I first read it. And I raced through The Bear and the Nightingale in a single night. That doesn't happen a lot, but again, because of that fairy tale-like aspect of the writing, it's so smooth in the reading of it. So I just didn't want to put it down, so I didn't. Did I suffer the next day? A little bit, but it was worth it. And then promptly I thrust my copy of The Bear and the Nightingale into the hands of my friend and said, read it. She hasn't yet, but I forgive her that. We all have other things going on. Now, slightly going to skip forward in my reading list because after I read the first book, I of course needed to read the second one again as well. And the second book of the Winter Night trilogy is called The Girl in the Tower, which originally also came out in 2017 and which I also read back then. Again, it was a book I devoured upon first reading it, and I again absolutely adored it. So without trying to spoil the plot of the first book too much, The Girl in the Tower kind of makes the world in which the trilogy is set a lot more expansive. So Vasya has kind of had to deal with these different conflicts around how she presents herself, how she behaves, but also these social and religious changes that are happening in her world and what her own path is there. She's also had to figure out why this winter demon is interested in her, who he is, and he's called Morozko. And you'll find a lot of him in Russian folklore as well. In The Girl in the Tower, as I said, the world is expanded. So suddenly Vasya also finds herself having to deal with incursions and frightened villagers, warriors raiding villages for young girls, and suddenly she finds herself in Moscow as well, at the court of the Grand Prince. We also get to know Vasya's siblings a lot better in this book, and it really kind of also shows the different expectations and roles that are placed on people. So, for example, her older sister features quite a bit more in the second book, and she's very much found herself in this straitjacket of the life of a noble woman. And her life and the way in which it is restricted, but also the safety that the sister finds in her more restricted life, is kind of contrasted to the danger that Vasya is always in because she kind of breaks the rules a bit. So I think The Girl in the Tower is an excellent expansion upon what we find out in the first book. And while I didn't read this one overnight, I also read this one quite quickly. There is, of course, a third book in this trilogy, which is called The Winter of the Witch. And I also have this one. This one initially came out in 2019. I also have this book waiting for me, but I'm trying not to race through this trilogy too quickly. So I'm saving that one for later. But those were two of my first reads in March. Now, I did also threaten you with non-fiction, and that is indeed the next thing I read, and this was a book for work. So as some of you know, I am currently writing my PhD about medieval Icelandic literature, which includes, of course, the sagas, but also Eddic poetry, etc. And, well, there's a lot of sagas, there's a lot of scholarship, and I decided that it was time to really sit down with some of the scholarship for one of the genres of saga material. And that was a book called Stories Set Forth with Fair Words, The Evolution of Medieval Romance in Iceland by Marianne Kalinke. This book talks about how a specific genre of saga literature developed in Iceland, and that is the romance genre. Now, you shouldn't confuse medieval romance with modern day romance. The romance of medieval literature was very much a courtly kind of romance, so we do kind of recognize some aspects maybe. There's kings, queens, princes, battles, etc., but there are also trolls, witches, spells, but it has a more courtly vibe. So it is still very much about men finding wives and continuing their kind of royal lines, their patrilineal lines, and making connections across different lands. So it's not necessarily a steamy romance as you might expect, and as you will find out later that I read as well. But Stories Set Forth with Fair Words kind of traces how the romance genre came to Iceland, how it was introduced through French medieval narratives, which first made their way to Norway and then from there to Iceland. And what I really like about Kalinke's book is how she kind of shows that this kind of foreign French material came to Iceland and was then adapted, almost appropriated, you could say, because they started writing romances for themselves, but bringing in their own kind of literary traditions. So, for example, you have the Maiden Warrior, or the Maiden King, and she shows up in these narratives in the Old Norse romances, but she does not in the French material. The French did not have these kind of Maiden Kings. And yeah, this was a really interesting book. I think it's also quite readable Kalinke takes a lot of time to introduce the narratives of the sagas, to kind of explain to you how the story works, what the different versions were, which aspects came from the French and which were then adapted, introduced. So even to an audience that isn't as familiar with medieval Icelandic literature, I would say it's still quite interesting. So give it a go. While reading nonfiction, I did also need a little bit of a distraction, and my book club decided to briefly pause our reading of The Fellowship of the Ring to dive into some other shorter classic literature. We wanted to read something fun, we wanted to read something short, just to kind of get ourselves ready for that last spurt of The Fellowship of the Ring. And the book we picked for that was Peter Pan by J.R.R. Barrie. I already did a whole episode about this book, so I don't necessarily need to go into too much detail here, also because the narrative of Peter Pan, of course, is quite familiar. But as I said in the episode on Peter Pan as well, it was quite a funny reading experience, because on the one hand it was quite enjoyable, and on the other hand I found myself not enjoying some aspects of the story. The way it spoke about gender roles, the way it also spoke about Native Americans, for example. So yeah, you can really tell that it's a book from the early 20th century. And I spent pretty much most of that episode on Peter Pan talking about how I wasn't sure how I felt about it. That is still the case, but let me just re-emphasize what I said there as well. Peter is a psychopath. There are just moments in the book where J.R.R. Barrie almost explicitly says that he has killed previous Lost Boys, that he is completely detached from his humanity, I guess, in order not to grow up, but that makes him quite scary. And I found it interesting that that aspect of the story was so strong in the original. I thought that perhaps, the modern desire to write prequels, etc., around villains was the reason that Hook is usually one of the main characters in modern adaptations, and that Peter is kind of often sketched as a bit of a villain there. And I thought that was just a modern take on a classic story, but no, Peter actually is quite villainous, especially if you bring modern gender expectations into the book as well. So yeah, I don't know if I'd want to reread this. I don't know if I'd want to read it to kids. It was really interesting to read a classic like this again, and to then discuss it with my book club, and to kind of figure out why we liked it, why we didn't. I think it's always good to read books from other time periods and confront yourself with the fact that, hey, society has changed, which means it can change again, etc. And yeah, give Peter Pan a go if you can read it and let it go, if that makes sense. But then, of course, with the book club, we also did decide to finish The Fellowship of the Ring. And, well, what do I say about The Fellowship of the Ring? I mean, of course I love Tolkien. I'm obsessed with medieval literature and Old English and Old Norse literature, as was Tolkien. So, of course, I enjoy The Lord of the Rings. Those films have been a defining thing for me in my early teens, I would say. And yeah, so it was really nice rereading the book. And also now that I've kind of worked myself back into medieval literature, its motifs, the way it tells stories, the way it creates characters, I have a much better grip of that ever since I started doing my PhD, I would say, because I'm writing more critically about it myself. And I recognize a lot of those aspects in Tolkien's writing, of course, because those were the stories he too was inspired by. And it was then quite nice to have some of that academic knowledge to maybe also understand why the reading of Tolkien can be difficult for modern readers as well, because he puts so much material and so much thinking into his plots. And yet there's also a certain gap between you and the characters. There's a lot of emotional and psychological depth in the characters, absolutely, but you don't necessarily get the same access to them that you might be used to from modern fantasy novels. So a lot of the things you really have to read about their characters out of their actions, which fits medieval literature very well. there is a big emphasis in a lot of medieval literature about the difference between private and public. And whereas nowadays we might think, okay, who you are in private with the people you trust, maybe in secret, that is who you really are. Whereas what you show publicly on Instagram or at work, well, that is a mask or a persona you put on for those environments. And in medieval literature, it's kind of flipped. Things you do in private, in secret, they're a bit suspicious. Whereas the things you do in public, even if they are performative, they are what contribute to your society. So in The Lord of the Rings, I would say that's something to be aware of as well, that if you want to know how a character is feeling, what they're doing, you have to look at what they're saying and what they're actively doing. So yeah, I really enjoyed rereading The Fellowship of the Ring. We've just started The Two Towers. And what was delightful but dangerous in the book club is that there is one member who has not read The Lord of the Rings before and has not seen the movies. So I kept having to bite my tongue and not betray what was going to happen next, especially because The Fellowship of the Ring as a book finishes sooner than the film. So the book ends just as the orcs show up to confront the Fellowship after they've crossed Rauros the river. So all the potential kidnappings and deaths that take place are part of the second book. So I had to sit there and be like, don't talk about it. Don't talk about what's about to happen. It hasn't happened yet. Don't spoil this book for your book club member. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. And I'm very excited to talk to them about The Two Towers soon. Then I read a book which has been sitting on my to-be-read list for 2 years now, and that is The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. The Rabbit Hutch is, I'm not quite sure how to give you an overview of the plot without spoiling anything, but also without getting into a rabbit warren myself. In short, I would say The Rabbit Hutch is about an apartment building in a kind of post-industrial Midwest, is how I think it's described in the official blurb. And in this apartment building, which is called The Rabbit Hutch, there are all kinds of people who live there, and we kind of get an insight into some of their stories and their backgrounds and what they're currently going through. But it really focuses on a group of 4 teenagers, which is made up of 3 younger men and 1 young woman. And the young woman is called Blandine, and she's really the main character. And it is clear from the beginning of the novel that something violent has happened between these 4 teenagers. And the narrative then jumps back a few days to kind of tell us everything that leads up to that moment, and to also tell us about their backgrounds and their stories. So these 4 teenagers, for example, all come from state foster care, and they've been given this apartment to kind of make their first steps into adulthood, but they all carry different things around with them. In the case of Blandine, this also means that we find out about a rather difficult situation from her past, including a teacher at the private school she went to on the scholarship. And it's quite haunting, this book, in some ways, because you're given such insight into these people. And there's all kinds of drama happening. And some of it feels a bit fantastical or almost absurd. But I think that is the point Tess Gunty was making as well. I think she draws certain things. She draws her colors very brightly, if that makes sense. It's like almost like a neon light kind of book. One thing that kind of after reading hit me a little bit with the main character Blandine is that she does have some manic pixie dream girl vibes at times, especially when we get her from other people's perspectives. So when the boys talk about her, or when we hear from her teacher or from the other people living in the apartment, there's something just slightly unearthly about her. But that is part of the character as well. So she herself is also slightly obsessed with medieval mystics, for example. So that is an aspect of the book that she doesn't entirely fit, perhaps. And none of the characters in the book truly seem to fit into a normal everyday world. There are the weirdest things in this book, and yet some of them also feel very real. Yeah, I don't know if that actually gives you an idea. I don't know if it makes you feel like I enjoyed the book, and I did. It took me, I'd say, a good 10% of the book to really feel like I'd arrived in it. But then I was there, and I wanted to know where it was going. And even though not all storylines worked equally well for me, Tess Gunty definitely has my attention now. So I'll very happily read whatever she writes next. Now, after reading something slightly dark, slightly mysterious, slightly abstract, the friend that I wanted to give The Bear and the Nightingale to said, why don't we do a book swap? And she gave me Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. Now, as I've mentioned, I think a few times in episodes like these, I'm not the biggest romance reader. And I think in part I'm gatekeeping the genre from myself, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I guess. But I have this, and maybe it's a leftover from the I'm not like other girls edgy phase that I did unfortunately also go through in my early teens. But yeah, I don't engage with romance a whole lot. But my friend really enjoyed this book, and I figured if I'm going to give you a book that I enjoyed, then it's only fair that I read a book you enjoyed. And so that's how I came to Love Theoretically. This is a part of Ali Hazelwood's kind of Women in STEM romance series, and it's about two physicists. The first is Elsie Hanaway. She's a theoretical physicist. She's just finished her PhD. Now she's an adjunct professor and she hates teaching. What she wants is a research position, and what she wants is tenure. And finally, there seems to be an opening and she could apply for a research position, and she does so. She's been invited for an interview. It's between her and one other person. Everything is great until she finds out that one of the people on the kind of hiring committee is Jack Smith, who is an experimental physicist. And he once wrote a paper about theoretical physics, basically saying that it was all nonsense. And he kind of betrayed her whole academic kind of field. And so she has anger feelings towards him for that. But what makes it even more difficult is that Elsie's jobs don't pay well. And so on the down low, she is a fake girlfriend who people can hire if they have family that keeps being like, why aren't you bringing a date? Or if they just need some emotional support at events, they can hire her for a day. And she'll then quite happily kind of morph into their perfect girlfriend for a day and then leave it behind. Jack has a brother who is kind of figuring out whether he wants a relationship, etc., but he wants his mother off his back. So this brother has hired Elsie, and they actually get along quite well in a friendship kind of way. And so she's actually met this Jack Smith in a family setting, and he's always been suspicious about her. She knows. And now there he sits in her hiring committee, and how is she going to explain to him that actually she's not in a relationship with his brother? She is an actual physicist and she needs this job. So that is our starting point. We have academic rivals, we have fake dating. There are all kinds of tropes in here, and it was a delightful read. It was very funny. Ali Hazelwood definitely wrote certain characters and certain lines to make you laugh, and she succeeded. As someone who is currently doing their PhD, admittedly not in kind of the sciences or in STEM, but as someone who's currently doing their PhD, Elsie's expectation of a research or even tenure position just shortly after her PhD are well, unrealistic to say the least. So that was the only aspect where, because of my own personal experience, I thought, well, okay, that doesn't work for me world building wise, but the rest was fun. I've recommended this book to some physicists in my own kind of social field, so I look forward to maybe hearing from them if it fits. But after I read Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood and said, that was fun, I'd be down for reading more of that, my friend and I realized that she'd also published a fantasy romance this year. And that is Bride, again by Ali Hazelwood. Now, a brief background on Ali Hazelwood. So she is now a romance writer, but before that she was a fan fiction writer for the ship known as Reylo, which is Kylo Ren and Rey from the Star Wars sequels. She used to write fan fiction on Archive of Her Own, and then she transitioned from that into actually published fiction. And I have no problem with that personally. I know for some people that seems to be an issue, and I'm like, no, she's always been writing. Just initially, she wrote for free online, kind of honing her craft, and now she's transitioned into publishing. The reason that is kind of relevant is that some of the characteristics from the characters she used to work with, so Rey and Kylo Ren, you can definitely see that in both Love Theoretically and in Bride. Also, for example, Elsie in Love Theoretically, she has a mentor figure that I could very clearly link to another Star Wars character. And I was like, okay, that's him. Okay, I know where this might be going then. Right? So she's working with those fanfic tropes, with those fanfic elements, but she's also definitely bringing in ideas of her own, developing her craft, honing it, etc. All of that is relevant to Bride because there are some fanfic tropes in here which are spicy. So it definitely gets heated in this book, and the way in which it gets heated is very much connected to a specific kind of genre of fan fiction, which has to do with werewolves and certain physical dynamics there. And yeah, I don't necessarily want to spoil that, but I would potentially say that if you want to read Bride, which I recommend, I'll give you a summary in a sec, know that you're going to get some weird physical stuff going on. Anyway, Bride is about Misery Locke, and she is the daughter of a powerful vampire councilman, and they live somewhere in the Southwest. The world isn't necessarily very built out, but you have enough world building to know what's going on. So she is a vampire herself, and the vampires have a rivalry both with the humans but also with the weres, so the werewolves that also exist. And yeah, there's been constant conflict between these three different groups, and they have sort of very fragile pieces in place. So there is kind of a peacekeeping alliance between the vampires and the humans where they exchange kids as collateral. So as long as the humans have a vampire child and the vampires have a human child, hopefully no war will break out. So Misery was one of those. She spent her entire childhood growing up amongst humans who kind of loathed her. And then when she became an adult, turned 18, she came back to the vampires and they all kind of hated her for having such human mannerisms. So Misery doesn't really fit in anywhere. But what makes it worse is that now she has to enter a new alliance, which is a marriage to the alpha of the werewolf pack called Low Moorland. Because again, maybe the vampires and werewolves should also have something of a peace treaty. So suddenly she finds herself married to a werewolf, living in werewolf territory and trying to figure out why he seems to hate her. And she also has another personal mission going on because a friend of hers has disappeared and she wants to know where her friend Serena is. So we then have our romance storyline where we're trying to figure out if these two rivals can make it work. And we have Misery's own kind of quest to find her friend. I really enjoyed it again, and what made this extra fun is that me and my friend read this as a buddy read. So we read the prologue and then the first two chapters, and then we exchanged voice notes and we were like, oh my god, what do you think, etc. Then we read kind of 10 chapters at a go and would send each other responses to what we'd read, and I received a number of messages being like, oh my god, you don't know what's about to happen, prepare. So yeah, that was a really fun way of reading this book, and I think that experience is definitely an extra part of why I enjoyed Bride so much. One thing I do appreciate about Ali Hazelwood's writing when it comes to the more steamy aspects of romance is that when she does have her characters kind of come together in a sexual way is that she allows for a certain kind of awkwardness, initial kind of phase of trying to figure each other out. So both in Love Theoretically and in Bride, you see characters kind of figure out like, okay, how do we literally fit together? Like, what is the best way of angling when we kiss or something? Like, is this a bit weird? Are you comfortable? Am I comfortable? And I think that's just quite nice that romance takes the time for those kind of conversations these days. If I think back to kind of some of the romance stories I then did read when I was still younger, you know, there's a lot of like grabbing and just going for it, etc. And, you know, the romance boys have finally learned to discuss consent. And that is good. So yeah, I like Bride. I liked Love Theoretically. Love Theoretically is definitely a more modern, kind of straightforward romance. It still has its steamy sides as well. But Bride has a bit more of a niche audience, perhaps, just because of some of the tropes it engages with. But if you're willing to give it a go, I would say absolutely do so. Now, I kind of skipped forward by discussing Bride, but I figured it worked well together with Love Theoretically. But Bride is actually the last book I read in March. So you got a slight spoiler there. But after Love Theoretically, I also dove back into the Alex Stern series by Leigh Bardugo. I spoke about the first book last month, I think. And this time I read the sequel, Hellbent, where our girl Alex, still at an Ivy League university, needs to figure out how to get her friend back from hell and how to survive another semester and how to deal with everything that she left behind in LA when she went to university. So it was a really nice continuation of the story. I definitely continue to be very fond of all the characters. One thing I didn't like so much about Hellbent is that it ended on an absolute cliffhanger. And I thought this was going to be a duology, but no. That ending made it very, very clear that, well, the story is not finished yet. And while I am very excited to get more of this world, I do enjoy it when books are a complete whole, if that makes sense. If a book has its entire story told, and that you can tell that this can be continued, that a next adventure is coming, or that whatever has just happened has consequences. But I don't want to be left in the middle of an adventure. That's also partially just my frustration that I have no idea when the next book is coming out. There's no pub info for this on Storygraph, so who knows when the third book is coming out. I will be reading it when it does. I'll probably have to reread Hellbent and Ninth House when it comes out, if it's going to take more than half a year. But that was Hellbent. I enjoyed it. It remains a very interesting and complex world, and I like Leigh Bardugo's writing style, which is why my next read was also by Leigh Bardugo, and this was The Language of Thorns, Midnight Tales and Danger as Magic, which is a collection of short stories she wrote within the Grishaverse, so within the world in which a lot of Leigh Bardugo's other books are set, like Shadow and Bone, etc. And I listened to this as an audiobook narrated by Lauren Fortgang because I wanted to listen to some fairy tales, some stories, and I saw this and I was like, hey, that could be fun. I like her writing. I've also listened to other audiobooks narrated by Lauren Fortgang, so I was like, I like her voice. Let's do it. I didn't have super high expectations. I really just wanted a collection that I could kind of fall asleep to while I played in the background. But then I ended up really enjoying it. So there aren't like countless of stories in this collection. I think it's about 5 or 6. But what I really like is the way that Leigh Bardugo wove different fairy tales that we know together into one story that very clearly took place in her own universe. So I have respect for how she did that, because I would read a story and be like, hey, this reminds me of Reynard the Fox stories, for example. But it also reminds me of Red Riding Hood. It also reminds me of this, and it reminds me of that. All of that within one story that then also felt quite true to the Grishaverse atmosphere she created in the Shadow and Bone books. So yeah, each of the stories made me kind of interested in different ways, which means I didn't fall asleep as quickly as I would have hoped. But I very much enjoyed each of the stories. In no way are they required reading for the Shadow and Bone books, for example. I think some of the stories, like The Witch of Duva, for example, are referenced maybe. But each of these stories takes place kind of in its own little bubble within this Grishaverse. So yeah, if you like fairy tales, if you like myth, folklore, magic, mermaids, sirens, danger, then this is absolutely an excellent collection of short stories. You do not need to have read the Shadow and Bone books to understand. You just need to go in accepting that you're in a world where mythological and legendary things can happen. So yeah, The Language of Thorns is definitely a recommendation. On my folktale vibe, I then also dove into the Watkins book of English folktales, which was edited by Neil Phillip. And this is very much just a collection of English folktales, as the title says. That's not a groundbreaking point I just made there. The collection has a foreword by Neil Gaiman, which is always lovely, and it has a quite extensive introduction by Neil Phillip himself, where he kind of traces the development in how scholarship has dealt with folklore and folktales in the UK, but specifically in England, and how these tales have been gathered, and how the perception of folktales also has changed. So there are over 100 folktales in here, and I haven't read all of them, but I've read quite a few. And it's just a really nice book to kind of dive in, open up at a random story, give it a read, and then also enjoy the notes that Phillip kind of has with every story. I really like these source notes, which detail where a story came from, different readings of it. So maybe this is a tale that has been told differently in another part of England, and then Neil Phillip will kind of explain what the differences are. One thing that's a little difficult is that some of the stories have absolutely been kept in their dialect, in the way in which they were told. So there was one story I really wanted to read, and as I was reading through it, I struggled because I couldn't really read the dialect very well. I really had to read it out loud and then figure out what was going on. So although that made for a more difficult reading experience, it was really nice to see that variety and the way that stories are literally told in dialect. So yeah, I think this is just a nice book to have lying around, standing on your bookshelves. The cover is gorgeous as well, and it's not the kind of book you would read in one go, absolutely not. But it's very fun to just open it up somewhere randomly in its 400 or so pages and treat yourself to a story. And so we get to the last book I read, which again technically is the penultimate book, because Bride was the last one. But for the sake of this episode, the last book I read was Howl's Moving Castle by Diane Wynne Jones. I adore this book. So actually, my first encounter with this story was through the Studio Ghibli film, which I love. What Hayao Miyazaki has done with this story in his animation film is beautiful. You can really see Miyazaki bring in his own kind of experiences growing up after World War II in Japan, and kind of the consequences of war and the cost that is a running theme through a lot of his films, and he really brings that into Howl's Moving Castle as well, even though that is not present in the book as written by Diane Wynne Jones. But that is a really good example of how a story can be adapted to be something very different and yet somehow very true, because the film, like the book, is also in love with magic. So Howl's Moving Castle by Diane Wynne Jones focuses on Sophie, who, as the blurb and as the first line says, has the great misfortune of being the eldest of 3 daughters, which means that she knows that if she were to kind of set out and seek her fortune and go on an adventure, she would fail, because that is just not the destiny for oldest daughters. It is youngest daughters who get to set out. So Sophie has kind of accepted that she's just going to spend the rest of her life working in her family's hat shop, and that she shouldn't have too high expectations. Unfortunately, she attracts the attention of the Witch of the Waste, who then puts Sophie under a spell which turns her into a very old lady. And she cannot tell anyone about this curse, which is just the extra bit of seasoning that makes it annoying. Being an old lady, she figures that she needs to leave home, and so she heads out, and there she encounters the moving castle of the wizard Howl. She barters her way in, becomes his cleaning lady, and realizes that Howl has struck a bargain with a fire demon. And the fire demon promised that if Sophie breaks their bargain, he will lift her curse. So we have that kind of going on, but we also get the kind of background to the wizard Howl, who he is, the Witch of the Waste, what's going on in their country. And there's a surprising link to where Howl comes from. The first time I read this book, it really surprised me that the wizard Howl wasn't quite what I expected from the film, but in a delightful way. And yeah, this was also a reread. I read this for the first time quite a while back and just remembered really enjoying it. And then I saw a paperback copy of it in my local bookstore and I figured, yes, you know what? I'm going to treat myself to it. It is a delightful book for fantasy and fairy tale lovers because it plays with all these different fantasy ideas and fairy tale ideas. What is a wizard? Is he going to kind of kill the maiden or not? Where is the real danger? What does the king do? Is the older sister always destined for drudgery or not, etc. And it's really fun the way Diane Wynne Jones kind of works all of this out. And I also really like the way that she builds up the character of Sophie as a young woman who is very much used to just doing what is expected, not necessarily speaking out for her, and how suddenly finding herself in this older body kind of gives her the freedom to, well, snap every once in a while and to stand up for what she wants and complain for the first time. And so you get a real sense of growth in Sophie that I find delightful. So where I wouldn't necessarily recommend Peter Pan for younger audiences, Howl's Moving Castle is absolutely a book you can give to young girls and boys. It is lovely. It's really good. So yeah, those were my books for March. Definitely enjoyed what I was reading. I've also started a number of other books, including Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros, but that book is like Bible thick. So that's going to take some time to work through, especially as the semester picks back up and as more and more things need to happen aside from reading. But yeah, those are my books, and I would love to hear what you've read. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.